Welcome. Come on in to Sunday School Teachings. My name is Imelda Trevino Engman, and this week we journey through the Book of Esther. This story takes place following the end of the Great Exile, when the remnant of Judah was returning to Jerusalem. It takes place in Susa, which would be in modern-day Iran. A genocide is proposed of the Jews in Persia, and the king does not realize he's being entrapped by signing it. It is up to a Jewish queen, Esther, to remedy the danger. Let's journey together. Though the book of Esther is only 10 chapters long, it is the 17th book of the Bible. The author is unknown, but possibly Mordecai, and some have suggested Ezra or Nehemiah because of the similarity of the writing style of the books. The purpose of Esther is to demonstrate God's sovereignty and his loving care for his people. Now, the book of Esther is 10 chapters long, as I mentioned, and we can divide those 10 chapters into 3 sections. First, a new queen and a foiled assassination, which is chapters 1 through 2. Chapters 1 through 5, the threatened disaster. Then chapters 6 through 10, the God of reversals. Let's journey. The book of Esther begins by describing the scene when Queen Vashti refused to obey an order from her husband, the King Xerxes. His counselors expressed concern that the queen's insubordination would lead to bad example for wives everywhere. They advised that she should be replaced, and so they dispose of her. So right away, their counselors are sent out to find a replacement queen. And many young women are gathered for the king's approval. Esther, which is not her, that is her name to help hide her identity because she's a Jew and she's working to hide her identity, is one of those young women. Esther was brought up by Mordecai, who is her cousin. And Esther is prepared, just like all the other young women, is prepared and presented, but Esther is chosen and made queen. Esther conceals her identity, as I mentioned. Mordecai saves the king's life by revealing a conspiracy against him by 2 of his men, Bigtan and Teresh. So Haman is promoted and gains respect. Mordecai does not bow to Haman, and Haman gets angry and seeks to kill not only Mordecai, but all the Jews. Haman obtains permission from the king to issue a decree to kill all Jews on the pretext that they separated themselves from the rest of the land and did not observe the king's laws. The date of killing is set for the 13th day of the 12th month. So Mordecai and Jews learn about the decree and mourn with sackcloth and ashes. Mordecai informs Esther of the law and advises her to speak with the king. Esther resolves to do so, even though she risks death for approaching the king because he hasn't invited her into his presence. And that is a cause for a penalty for death. The Jews fast for 3 days. Esther invites the king, and the king welcomes her. As she goes into his quarters, the king invites her in, holding out his scepter to her to indicate that she will not be killed. Esther invites the king and Haman to a feast on the following day. Haman is frustrated by Mordecai's continued refusal to bow before him, so his wife advises him to have a gallows built and to request the king at the banquet to have Mordecai hung. So as we shift into chapter 6, we learn that the king has had a restless night, and when he asks his chronicles, he asks the chronicles be read to him, the king discovers that Mordecai was never rewarded for saving his life. The king asks Haman to lead the parade of honor for Mordecai. Haman mourns and is frustrated over this, and his wife warns him that Mordecai is starting to rise in status, and he hurries to the banquet. Esther begs for her life at the banquet and the lives of the Jews so they may be spared. The king is angry because he's not understanding until Haman, he realizes that he had signed the decree to have all the Jews annihilated, and he did not realize that Esther was a Jew. Haman pleads for his life before the queen. When the king enters, Haman trips onto her couch, so the king thinks he is assaulting her, and Haman is hung on the very gallows that was made for Mordecai. Esther is given Haman's property, and Mordecai assumes Haman's place. Esther begs the king to save the Jews. The decree, though, is irrevocable, once ratified by the king, but the counter decree is issued allowing the Jews to protect themselves on the day they were scheduled for annihilation. When the Jews hear the news, they rejoice. Many in the land become Jews because fear of the Jews, coming after them. Jews defend themselves, killing 75,000 enemies. Mordecai is very prominent citizen. At Esther's request, Haman's 10 sons are hung. Jewish celebrate victory, and Purim is declared an annual festival for all Jews. Purim is derived from the meaning of pure, meaning lots, and refers to the lottery that Haman used to choose a date for the massacre. The king's empire is strong. Mordecai is popular and a powerful ruler under the king, and his story is recorded in the official records. Now let's take a look at some of the themes that are found in Esther. First, God's sovereignty. The book of Esther tells us circumstances that were essential to the survival of God's people in Persia. These events were not the result of change, but of God's grand design. God is sovereign over every area of life. With God in charge, we can take courage. He can guide us through every circumstance, and we should expect him to display his power in carrying out his will. Racial hatred. The Jews in Persia had been a minority since their deportation from Judah 100 years earlier. Haman is a descendant of one of the enemies of the Jews, of one of the descendant kings, which was an enemy of the Jews. So lust for power and pride drove Haman to hate Mordecai. Esther's cousin, Haman, convinced the king to kill all Haman to hate Mordecai and Esther's cousin. Haman convinced the king to kill all the Jews. Radical hatred is always sinful. We must never condone it in any form. Every person on earth has intrinsic worth because God created people in his own image. Therefore, God's people must stand against racism wherever and whenever it occurs. Deliverance. Purim means lots, as I mentioned earlier, such as those used by Haman to set the date for the extermination of all the Jews in Persia. But God overruled this plot, using Esther, Queen Esther, to intercede on behalf of the Jews, a Jew herself. And again, the king did not realize that she was a Jew. Because God is in control of history, he is never frustrated by any turn of events or human action. He can save us from the evil of this world and deliver us from sin and death. Because we trust God, we are not to fear people. we are not to fear what people may do to us. Instead, we are to be confident in God's control, that God is in control. Action. Faced by death, Esther and Mordecai set aside their own fears and acted. Esther risked her life by asking the king to save the Jews. When outnumbered and powerless, it is natural to feel helpless. Esther and Mordecai resisted this temptation and acted with courage to follow God's guidance. Wisdom. The Jews were the minority in a world hostile to them. It took great wisdom for Mordecai to survive. Serving as faithful officials of the king, Mordecai took steps to understand and work within the Persian law. Yet he did not want to compromise his integrity. To survive in non-believing world takes great wisdom. In a setting that is, for the most part, hostile to Christianity or Christians, we can demonstrate wisdom by giving respect to what is true and good and be humble and humbly standing against what is wrong. So let's take a look as we journey here with Esther. As you read the book of Esther, we learn through her courageous act, a whole nation was saved. Is God asking you to do something that may seem impossible? Something to think about. One of the most understood verses in Esther is verse 14, chapter 4, verse 14. If you keep quiet in a time like this, deliverance and relief for the Jews will arise from some other place, but you and your relatives will die. Who knows if perhaps you were made a queen for just such a time as this. So as you journey as a family through the book of Esther, these chapters 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 are more tailored to younger minds. And so I encourage you to navigate through those chapters with your young family members. I encourage you to journey together and have a wonderful time doing so. I want to thank you for joining me for this short video on Esther, and until next time, be blessed.